Well, hey folks, Mr. Bleeker here. Our next major topic in eCampus Live Biology 12 is biochemistry, so let's get to it. Head on over to the course site and click on Lessons. I've already got that loaded, so I'll pop over to this tab here. There you go. So the topics that we'll be covering will be the elements, water, and the polar nature of water. It's an interesting compound making life on our planet possible. If you think about water, think of it as having a positive end and a negative end. That's what we mean by polar, and it gives it some very interesting properties. Of course, in order to understand these properties, we'll have to study ionic bonding, covalent bonding. This might all sound familiar from chemistry. And we'll look at other additional nutrients in the course, carbohydrates, sugars, lipids down here, which are fats, oils, or waxes, and we'll even take a look at steroids there too. We'll look at DNA and what it makes from amino acids, which is protein. And we've got some great animations for you here. Water, the universal solvent. It is a polar molecule. And how water can be used to build things up or synthesize and tear them apart by a process we call hydrolysis, or hydrolysis for short. So we've got a lot to do. Let's get to it. All right. Click on this little doodad here, and you should be seeing this presentation show. There you go. The chemistry of life, elements, and water. Now, one of the things you might remember from grade 8 is that matter, definition matters anything that has mass and occupies space. So I'm just going to switch my pencil here. Brown's not going to work out so well. Let's choose the extreme. If you remember from grade 8, remember that old density calculation. Oop, let's see if it'll be better for me. There we go. Think of your mass as taking up room. Density is mass divided by volume. And matter itself, this little doodad here, can neither be created nor destroyed. It can be converted from one form to another. For example, you can burn wood and it'll float away as different materials, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxides and things like that. But that mass is never lost. It's just converted from one form to another. One thing's for sure, though, is that no matter whether something is alive or dead, everything in our universe is composed of matter. Now, matter can weigh different amounts depending on which planet you're on, but that's just a function of gravity. For example, on the Earth, you would weigh one thing. If you go to the moon, much smaller sort of body, it has less gravity, you would weigh less. But the point is, your matter would stay the same. You would still have the same number of atoms and molecules inside your body. So we have to get into that whole topic of what's an atom, and this will take you a little bit into your chemistry experience. So rely on what you know. You've probably heard a lot of this already. If you haven't, well, we'll do our best here. Now, there's a whole bunch of writing here. I'm not interested in that. I like the images a lot more. When we look at basic atomic structure, this is called the planetary model. It sort of looks like a mass in the middle with little things zooming around the outside. Well, let's name what those things are. As you recall, I'm hoping you recall, the center of any atom is its nucleus. And in that center, you have protons and you have neutrons. Now, protons are the most, well, I shouldn't say the most important. They are what identify the atom as being a certain type. Let's pop over here to the periodic table. Here we go. When you look at hydrogen, right here, hydrogen itself, switch colors. Oh, we have to give that a name. Hydrogen, let's go with blue. In its nucleus, just has a single solitary proton. Let me write. Let's see if I can get that. Come on. So it just has a proton in the center, and what's moving around the outside, tracking around the outside like this in an orbital, is the electron. And the electron will give a negative charge, sort of zooming around the outside. But the nucleus is this central region. And we've Sort of saw that here. Now this atom itself has a couple of items in it. It has protons and it has electrons and it has neutrons. But in the nucleus per se, you find neutrons and protons. Now some things don't necessarily have neutrons. Neutrons are like extra weight, excess baggage. They make things heavier, but they don't change the identity of the element. Case in point, I'll pop out to the web here. Here's an interesting little doodad from Wikipedia. When you look at hydrogen, probably the way you've always thought of it is just as periodic table, it's atomic number 1, so it has 1 proton. Okay, it has 1 electron whizzing around the outside. Now, its atomic number is 1 because of its number of protons. If we look at a cousin of hydrogen right here, it's still hydrogen. You notice now it's got a neutron in there. Neutrons can make things heavier. So now, when we look at this, the atomic number, you see the number there is 1, is the same, so it's still hydrogen, but its atomic mass has gone up by 1. Here's a little rule to remember. Protons and neutrons weigh 1 atomic mass unit. Just think of it as adding whole numbers together. So this is still hydrogen, 1 proton, so its atomic number is 1, but since there are 2 things in its nucleus, a proton and a neutron, it has a mass of 2. Now, we call these things isotopes. It's the same element, but it's heavier. That's because it's got more neutrons in it. If you look at tritium over here, that's when hydrogen has 2 neutrons in its nucleus. It doesn't change it from being hydrogen, it's just making it heavier. It still has the 1 electron whizzing around the outside. So you just got an introduction to basically what makes atomic structure. The proton, right, these white ones here, has an atomic mass of 1. Neutrons, similarly, the red ones here, also have an atomic mass of 1. So if you looked at this atom, you'd just count them up and you'd say, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This thing has an atomic mass of 5. The electrons themselves have negligible mass. They're whizzing around the outside. Electrons have nothing to do with the nucleus. They're in orbit around the outside. So their atomic mass is pretty well nothing. And if you think about that, it makes a lot of sense. When electricity is flowing through a wire, and electricity is just, current electricity is just flowing electrons, the atomic mass of an electron is nothing. The wire would never weigh any more substantially, anything that you could detect with any scale that we have, with the electricity flowing through the wire. It's just so negligible. So there's your basic atomic structure. So protons are important because they give an atomic mass unit of 1, that's right, but most importantly, they give the atom their identity or their atomic number. So the atomic number, just pop just over here for a second, of hydrogen is 1 proton. And the way the periodic table works is you go horizontally, so go across the row, and this guy over here, helium, has an atomic number of 2. Now the mass shows as 4. The reason you see the decimal is there's a very tiny negligible amount of mass for the electrons. Just don't even worry about it, just discount it. At least for the purposes of our lecture. When you go over to lithium, its atomic mass is approaching 7. Its atomic number is 3. So when I see that, lithium has 3 protons. When I look at beryllium, 4 protons. Sodium, 11 protons. If the number of protons in the nucleus changes, you get a new element. And in around grade 10, you studied radioactive decay. Some elements can fall apart and they turn into other elements. Remember that it's the number of protons that identifies what element you're looking at in the periodic table. And any trip out to the internet for periodic table of the elements will give you this, where it shows you how to read it with the atomic number. Silicon is 14. Yep, 14 protons. Its atomic weight is around 28. Well, I can pretty well figure the only way to get from 14 to 28 would be adding in probably 14 neutrons. So silicon probably has 14 neutrons in its nucleus. Look it up. True story. So neutrons themselves, they contribute nothing. There's no charge on a neutron. That's part of the name there, neutron, neutral. But they do give additional weight. And that's how we form these little things called isotopes. Just different versions. They give them some different characteristics, but the atomic number, the element you're looking at, hasn't changed. Electrons, they're mostly involved. A good thing to think about with the electrons is the chemical bonding, right? The attraction between different metals, nonmetals, the attraction between nonmetals and nonmetals. At this point, this is where I'll introduce the idea of atomic bonding. If you recall ionic bonds, when metals and nonmetals get together. And if you remember with covalent bonds, that would be when nonmetals are sharing electrons. I just wanted to familiarize you with that for a second. Sorry, folks. So move forward from that into a little bit of our atomic theory. Actually, now would be a good time. I'm going to pop out of my mirroring, and I'll go over here. Okay, ionic bonding. When an element gives up an electron, it's said to be ionized. Let's go through a quick little sort of ionic bonding tutorial. When you're looking at ionic bonds, some things on the periodic table want to give up electrons, and other things would like to take them. So interesting thing about ions is there's really two types. There's positive ions and negative ions. And things of a similar charge, they don't really want anything to do with each other. So negatives repel just like positives would. So that doesn't work so well, does it? Now, with ionic bonding, what I want you to picture here, picture things on the left side of the periodic table as being positive. And those things on the left side of the periodic table are known as metals. And the things on the right side of the periodic table are nonmetals. So this is a metal-nonmetal sort of get-together. Now, metals tend to give up electrons, so they're positively charged. And nonmetals love them for a reason I'll explain later. So because they take on a lot of electrons, they tend to be negatively charged. This is why metals and nonmetals love to get together for ionic bonds. This is why they're so strong. Because this guy being positively charged, look at that. Lead him on a little bit. Follow me, follow me, follow me. Opposites attract. So metals and nonmetals, just due to the nature of the bonding that they'll do, in this case, we call this an ionic bond. Okay. Now, that's with metals and nonmetals. I'll just go back to our periodic table here. If you've looked at the periodic table, there's a stepped line right over here that marks the difference between the metals and the nonmetals. As you get closer to that line, there we go, it starts to become a little less clear whether items are metals and nonmetals. They start to become sort of transitional. But for the purpose of this lecture, the items on the left side of the table, the left side of that line, we call the metals, and the items on the right side we'll call the nonmetals. And if you look at the periodic table, and if you've wondered how are things arranged, they're arranged into vertical groups. For example, the gray we call the alkalis. The greens there are the alkali earth metals. Go through transitional ones till you hit the transition line between the metals and the nonmetals, and then you get into some of the nonmetals. It gets really interesting when you get to fluorine, chlorine. I'll grab my pen again here. When you get to these guys here, these are known as the halogens. I'll just erase this after I'm done. And they're very, very close to the end of the periodic table. It's like running a race. They've almost made it. If each one of those elements can just get its hand on one more electron, then it would be like the noble gases. And these are noble because the number of protons equals the number of electrons. Totally stable, totally happy. Their plate is full. Pop out. A little bit more chatting to do about that. So we'll come back a little bit more about ionic bonding in a minute. So when you look at the periodic table, they've left the numbers off here, but if you consider that hydrogen is number 1, there we go, then as you go across the table, helium is 2, lithium is, just hold still there, lithium is 3, oh, being a pain. Try that again. Sometimes my stylus doesn't always work the way I want it to. Lithium is 3, beryllium is 4, boron is 5. As I go across, I just know that one more proton is being added to each element, and we're going along the periodic table. For example, carbon is 6. A very brutalized 6, but there you go. Nitrogen 7, oxygen 8. Now, all living things and non-living things are made out of these elements. When you look at, let's see if I could shrink that down a little bit. Oh, it's not going to show up. Proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, all these important things that are important for life are made out of just these elements in the periodic table. You're worth about $12 to $14 worth of chemicals if we add up all the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and the trace minerals that are found in your body. Yep, we're just living instantiations of the periodic table. But those elements come together in fascinating ways. That's why we call it biochemistry. Right here, let's bring up a color that matters. There we go. You'd be looking at the composition that makes DNA. Down here, you'd be looking at amino acids. These eventually make proteins. Notice the nitrogen and the carbon and the hydrogen. And over here, you find these, they're called phospholipids. You'll find these making up your cell membranes. Some pretty impressive stuff. We'll get into this in quite a bit of detail in this course. Let's see here. There we go. Sometimes I just have to reload it. It's a little bit tired. Okay. Here we go. As far as biologically important elements, your bones are comprised of calcium. There's a fair bit of phosphorus in your bones. Your DNA is full of it. The energy compound called adenosine triphosphate, that's the main energy source in your body, believe it or not. It's almost exclusively a phosphorus storing compound. You have sulfur and amino acids, sodium to make your muscles contract and your nerves fire, potassium, well, without that, your nerves won't fire at all. Iron, interesting little compound in your red blood cells that carries oxygen throughout your body. And without magnesium, plants wouldn't be able to do photosynthesis. It's such an important part of chlorophyll, that green stuff you find in leaves. So chemical bonding, like how do we get all these different combinations that come together? These ionic compounds and these covalent compounds. Well, just a quick little review is warranted, and we've sort of seen this a little bit. We'll start with ionic bonding, which is when electrons are either donated or received. So think about them as just being exchanged. And some atoms, especially the metals, love to get rid of their electrons. And I'll give you a reason for that in a minute, but it helps to make them stable. Everything in the periodic table is sort of trying to become like the noble gases. And they can't change the number of protons, but they can mess around with the electrons on the outside. Here's a case point in that. If you rub a balloon on your hair and it builds up static electricity, the electrons have literally rubbed off the hair shafts. So electrons can be gained or lost. So that's an interesting trick to try to become like a noble gas. So look at ionic bonding, for example. Here's case in point. When you look at sodium, and they don't draw it in here, but its atomic number is 11. Now, when it begins, this is how the elements will begin. For example, sodium will have 11 electrons, and in the first shell, you'll find it has space for a maximum of 2 electrons. The second shell has space for 8. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now it's full. So there's a little pattern here. The first couple of shells go 2, 8, 8, 18 for the number of electrons that they can contain. And we'll just go that far to keep it simple. Now if we consider that we've gone and maximized our first 2 shells, 2 and 8, then there's a sole solitary electron hanging around on the outside. Look at this poor little devil. Looks pretty lonely, doesn't he? Well, he's hoping to have 7 more friends to fill up his outer shell, but he's all alone. So sodium really has a choice. Is it realistic to gain 7 electrons? Really, to fill up that outer shell? No. The easiest thing is to get rid of that outer electron. It's just kind of lonely. So sodium and a lot of metals will try to get rid of their outer few electrons to make themselves stable. That's why when they get rid of their electrons, if you got rid of your negative charge, you become more positive. Now, let's consider the case of chlorine. Now, chlorine is just 1 away from the end of the periodic table. It's just about to the end of the finish line. Now, when you look at chlorine's atomic number, it's 17. Well, let's just see here. So its atomic number is 17. So what that means is, and we'll draw on the electrons, chlorine had filled up 2 there, and it had filled all 8, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. 2 and 8, that's 10, and it still has 7 more to go. Now you can see, it's absolutely longing. It wishes it could have 1 more electron, right? And then it would be stable in its outer shell. So sodium has what chlorine wants. Chlorine, which is a nonmetal, would love to get 1 more electron, and sodium would love to get rid of it. Now let's pause for a second and look at the periodic table. I'll just say accept there. Now let's see here. Look at our periodic table. I think I can just sneak out to it. Oh, here, I'll just call up this app. Neat little one. Here, I just picked up, nice little freebie, K12 periodic table. Let it load for a second. Now, if you look at fluorine, if it can get 1 more, just 1 more electron, it's still going to be element 9. But its outer shell will fill up, and it will be just like neon. It would have all 8 in the outside. And if you look at this little graphic here, right, those little dots represent the electrons. So it would be full. Now, here's what I'll show you. If sodium, right here, it's got that sort of pathetic electron in its outer shell. If sodium can get rid of it, then it is like, we'll back up one from 11 to 10. Now, sodium doesn't become element 10, but its outer shell does. See that? Sodium can become like neon. Sorry. Chlorine, my apologies, steps to argon. There we go. Sorry, I accidentally clicked neon. If chlorine can just get 1 more, then as far as its electrons, it looks like the 18th element. If chlorine can get rid of that electron, then its electrons look like the 10th element. And it's cool to be a noble gas. I mean, they're noble, right? So their outer shells are stable, and this gives them stability is what it's all about. So go back to our lecture here. On the right-hand side here, see if I can move that. There we go. Sodium releases its electron, which is what's showing here, and gives that right there to chlorine. Now what happens is sodium will become positive as a result because it has more electrons in its nucleus. So it's a little bit more powerful, right? It's positively charged. And chlorine has one additional electron, so it has more negative charge by 1 than it has protons. So it becomes negative. Well, sodium is one of the nastiest elements on the planet. You can't even add it to water. It'll form hydrogen gas, and that gas will burn. Chlorine, well, if you recall, chlorine, we use it adding it to pools. It's been used in warfare, unfortunately. It will combine with water and form hydrochloric acid. It's one of the nastiest things on our planet. I mean, in the Geneva Conventions, you can't use it for the purposes of warfare. It's a horrifying thing. Sodium and chlorine, you bring it together, and you get an ionic compound known as table salt, that white stuff, right, that you put on your corn, that I give my dad heck for putting way too much on his food, right? So that's ionic bonding. I'll just one more thing to say about it. When these two get together, when you look at ionic bonds, you tend to get what are called ionic crystals. And for example, salt. I should be able to call that up for you. Lickety-split, not a problem. When you look at, there we go. When you look at salt, for example, and you put sodium and chlorine together, you will get a very powerful crystallized structure. It does not want to come apart. It is a very strong bond, that positive and negative charge. It's very hard to overcome. So a lot of the ionic compounds tend to crystallize. Now, covalent bonding is a little bit different. Covalent bonding is when you have things on the right side of the periodic table. You have a non-metal plays sharesies with a non-metal. And it's interesting. When you look at methane, methane itself is produced by biological critters. When you release a fart, we'll just come right out and say it, you release a lot of methane, some sulfur, but a lot of methane. It's also known as natural gas. Now, the thing about nonmetals is they want to share electrons. They tend to share them. Sometimes there's a little bit of hoarding going on, but they don't just give them away, right? They tend to keep them. Well, when you look at, let's undo that. When you look at hydrogen, it's got 1 electron to share. And carbon, well, in its outer shell, it's got 4 electrons to share. Now, if you look at carbon, we'll go back to the periodic table. This is kind of interesting. Look at carbon. It is right... I'll have to wait for it to load. Carbon is 4 steps away from the end of the periodic table. Okay, so it's got a bit of a conundrum, right? It wants to fill up its outer shell. It doesn't want those 4 dots, those 4 electrons. It wants 8. So it needs to get 1, 2, come on, keep up with me, 3, 4. And then carbon in its outside would look like neon, and it would be looking, awesome, fully dressed. Well, who do you know that could share, now because carbon is, when you look at carbon, it's an interesting one, right? It's a non-metal. Hydrogen itself is both a metal and a non-metal. It's the first thing in the periodic table. It can share or give away electrons. It's a very interesting one. For this purpose, we'll consider it as a non-metal. If hydrogen comes along and plays sharesies and gives 1 electron to carbon in each position, so if 4 hydrogens come in and share, then that sharing arrangement would make carbon's outer shell full. So it would look like neon. I digress. Let's see what that looks like. So here's your covalent bond. The sharing, and I'll just circle them right here, makes everybody happy. You see, hydrogen only has 1 orbital, 1 sort of electron orbital around the outside. It can only hold 2. So hydrogen is happy. It's got 2. Now hydrogen, if hydrogen has 2 electrons, it looks like helium, which is the first noble gas. Pretty good. So basically, electronically, you have a bunch of heliums, and in the center, carbon is happy and looking like its noble gas. So everybody's stable, everybody's happy. Now these bonds, because they're sharesies, aren't as strong as ionic bonds. So you've got ionic and you've got covalent. Remember that ionic is metal-nonmetal. Remember that covalent is non-metal-nonmetal. Okay, we're getting somewhere. And here's your periodic table. Everybody wants to get here, right? The orange noble gases. The part that I've kind of been not stating up to this point because I didn't want to make it too complicated was when you look at the arrangement of the periodic table, when you look at, let's see here, right here, the alkalis, everything in this group would just wants to give up 1 electron, and then it can back up and be like its nearest noble gas, with the exception of hydrogen. Hydrogen can't back up from position 1. So because these want to give up an electron, these guys tend to be positively charged by 1. If you give up 1 electron, then you're +1 because your nucleus has 1 extra proton. These alkali earth metals, if you look at beryllium, it would love to back up by 2. It's a lot easier to back up by 2, to give away 2 electrons. So things in this group, the alkali earth metals, have a positive 2 charge. Similarly, this group over here, known as the halogens, or halogens for short, just need to do a little erasing. There we go. Are they going to let me? No, of course not. This group right here, I'll just circle them. They will do just about anything to accept an electron. And so because they'll take an electron, these halogens tend to have a -1 charge because they'll always take an electron, so that'll make them negative by 1. So little secrets of the periodic table, stepping over to be like your noble gas. You can do it ionically, you can do it covalently. Sharing or donating. Just depends if you're metal or non-metal. Just a quick little analysis of things that are in different critters. If you look at the Earth's crust and oxygen and the silicon, that's kind of interesting. You see the humans and pumpkins, well, they'll be our plant example, are massive stores of oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And plants, you see more of a focus on the carbohydrates, right? The carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. More than us, right? We are focusing, we have more sort of tissue and muscle and bone. So you see different proportions. But these elements are a result of being on this planet. That's where they come from. True story. Break it down. These numbers tend to fluctuate a little bit, but you could see, well, your muscle tissue is primarily nitrogenous, protein nitrogenous. So it's coming up in the 4th spot at 3%. Calcium in your bones. The trace elements, you don't need very much of them. I mean, for example, when you look at, I didn't want that. When you look at iron in our red blood cells, plays a pretty important role, but it's not an overriding element in our body. It's just quite important. Okay. So I'm going to call this first lecture, and then I'm going to move into the chemistry of water. I'm going to break it into 2 parts. So now would be a good time to go get a sandwich, have a break. All right, I'm going to break this lecture into 2 parts. Have a good one.